Good evening, and thank you so much all for coming. We've just had a brief chat, especially to all the young students going to take the civil services exams, to all the young ladies especially, all the young women who are here. It's great to see you all. Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran, as Monaji just said, is one of India's best and brightest minds, thinkers, diplomats, and we're hugely grateful for the opportunity to have him here in Mumbai, for all of you to meet him, to talk to him. And I'm going to start this. So we're talking about the relationship between India and China, Asia's largest powers. China, as we know, is not only an Asian power, but is a rising world power. And to look at this relationship in all its dimensions, in all its complexity, I'm going to take you through this very brief presentation, which my colleague Sushant Singh in the Delhi office has put together, and talking about life after the Doklam crisis, but we will talk about other issues of the India-China relationship as well. So quickly, just to take you through this presentation, India's long border with China, 3,500 kilometers approximately. The western sector, which is 1,570 kilometers, the central sector, and which is 545 kilometers, and the eastern sector, 1,325 kilometers. Here there are slides of the eastern, western, both contested sectors, and we know that the conflict, the border conflict, the war, however you want to describe it, in 1962 was fought on both these sectors. The Sikkim sector settled now since 1975, of course, Sikkim merged with China, but in 2003, it took China that long to accept the merger, Sikkim's merger with India, and in 2005, you have the Chinese maps which accept that Sikkim is a part of India. And there can you see, if you look at the disputed tri-junction, so you have Nepal on one side, Bhutan on the other, Bangladesh, of course, in the south, and Sikkim between Nepal and Bhutan. And if you see that Chumby Valley, can you see that? So it's really, it's described very often by foreign policy experts as a heart that's sort of driving into India. So that's the Chumby Valley, which is where where part of this Doklam standoff took place. We will discuss that much more. In 1959, do you know who that is? The Dalai Lama, who escaped from Tibet and came to India. Do you know where he lives? Good, Dharamshala. He lives in Dharamshala. He's an 82-year-old man, incredibly energetic and fit, and a very bright human being. So if any of you had the opportunity to meet him, you must. Newspapers of the Indian Express from the time, 1962, when China attacks on both fronts. In 1962, some figures on the killed and the wounded, India and China, 1,383 soldiers in India, 722 in China, the wounded and the missing. And then we have that Sushant Singh's story on the Doklam standoff and a little bit of history about this region. Now, in 1986, and the former Foreign Secretary, Mr. Saran, will tell us a little bit about this place called Sumdorong-chu, in case any of you have heard it, and the Wangdong incident, and how the Chinese troops occupied that ridge, and the Indian government held firm, much like it did in Doklam over the last couple of months. And in a sense, the Doklam standoff was a rerun of the Sumdorong-chu, but we'll hear more about that. We have a quick timeline here. 1979, diplomatic relations re-established between India and China. After 1962, after the war or the border conflict in 1962. Can you see from this side? Oh, you've got this. So after 1962, it took 17 years for diplomatic relations to be re-established. 1988, Rajiv Gandhi makes a very, very important visit to China. 1993, followed up by former Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao. And Again, 2003, former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And that's a very important visit because you have special representatives from India and China who were then mandated to discuss the border issue, to resolve the border issue that has been left over from history. And 2005, political parameters and guiding principles. This is when both countries decided to delineate some of these principles. Now, this is the incident in Pangong Sulek, which again happened during the and we know that over the last 3 or 4 years, May 2013, this is during the UPA government, Manmohan Singh's time, in Depsang, Chumar in 2014, September. Very interesting, very, very important, because at the time, General Secretary and the Chinese President was visiting India, Xi Jinping. He was in India, and you can see this photograph between the Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping in Ahmedabad. This is 2014, and the incident, the incursion takes place in Chumar. And then the Doklam, the Doklam incident itself. I think some of you, in fact, should go back, when you go back home, and Google this. This would be a really interesting story. This is Neville Maxwell, who wrote the book on China. Now we have the disengagement on August 28th. So after 72 days, Indian and Chinese troops withdrew, disengaged from the Doklam Plateau. But while a lot of these slides are about the Doklam Plateau, what I would like to focus on is about the relationship between India and China and life after Doklam. And sir, to ask you the first question, India and China are Asia's largest powers, of course. In 1949, Mao comes to Beijing, and the Long March comes to an end, and the Chinese Communist Party establishes itself properly in Beijing. 1947, India becomes independent. So India and China, in a sense, the twins of Asia, they've been independent or the Chinese have been in power for the last 70 to 72 years. But there is a big difference between these two countries. How would you explain that?
Well, thank you very much, Jyoti. And I think you did a very good job, almost like a professor, setting the stage for this conversation. And I would like to thank all of you for braving very, very inclement weather to be here this evening. I really appreciate the trouble that you have taken to be here. So, if we go back to the period when India became independent in 1947, China describes 1949 as the liberation of China from a semi-colonial status. At that time, there was a great deal of hope. There was a sense that history was coming back to Asia. Asia, which had been the home to two of the richest civilizations in the world, both India and China. And these were civilizations which had survived for millennia, for several thousand years. And they were coming into their own, in a sense, after a period of darkness, colonial India, semi-colonial China, aggression by Japan, the kind of oppression that they had to suffer under imperialist powers like Britain and European powers, even the United States of America. So this was really a moment of great hope. And if you recall, in 1946 itself, Prime Minister Nehru convened the Asia Relations Conference. And the whole purpose of that conference was to really set the stage for, as I said, Asia coming back into its own. And Nehru certainly felt that any resurgence of Asia could only come about if India and China were able to work together. For the first few years, in fact, that is what was happening. Both the countries were actually working together. There was the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that all you must have heard about, you know, the Panchsheel. And yet, I think the reason why that particular hopeful phase did not really survive was precisely because the two countries were engaged in very difficult task of nation building, consolidation of state power, and in that process started, you know, bumping up against each other. Most importantly, because Tibet, which was more or less an independent entity for many centuries, then was occupied by China. And for the first time in history, really India and China became neighbors, direct neighbors. Before that, they were not neighbors. They were two very brilliant civilizations, but comfortably, in a sense, away from one another. So this is the fact that they suddenly came face to face with one another, despite the fact that they were both Asian powers, Asian civilizations. But these, as you were perhaps hinting, that these are two very different countries. Their cultural, background is very different. The historical background is different. The way in which they think is very different.
How are they different? In what way?
So, China over millennia has been essentially a very self-contained power. It has, even though, you know, we today talk about the Silk Road and we talk about how China was really at the center of trade routes, it was not. I mean, Chinese silk was being traded, but it was not as if the Chinese were trading. The trade was carried out by very different, tribes living on the periphery of China. So the development of China, the development of Chinese culture was, in a sense, something rather autonomous. And that is why Chinese culture is so different from other cultures. You know, just the writing, Chinese writing, for example, there is no alphabet. There are Chinese characters. Each one of them is like a picture. The sophistication in terms of thinking which that introduces is very different from what we have in India. India is different because India, to my mind, has been always a crossroads culture. You know, it has been at the intersecting point of maritime routes, you know, to the west of India, to the east of India, the whole peninsular character of India, the monsoon winds actually connected us to both to the western reaches of the Indian Ocean as well as to the eastern reaches. Caravan routes going into Central Asia, including China, which also spread Buddhism to Central Asia, to China. So India, through many, many centuries, was really a crossroads culture. And that crossroads culture gave India a kind of a cosmopolitan spirit, in a sense, a global citizen that Indian was. Very different from China, very insular, not so comfortable dealing with the rest of the world. So these were two very different cultures. And one of the problems has been really, because of that difference, the frequent misunderstanding and misperception which arises between the two sides.
Now we'll talk about this misperception, of course, most recently at Doklam, at Sumdarongchu, and of course the 1962 border conflict. But I want to ask you, China calls itself the Middle Kingdom. And in English we have words like kowtow, which would mean that you're sort of submitting to the Chinese or paying obeisance. How does that happen? Do you think that words like this are part of the Chinese mind or thinking, which is, and that's why they want other nations to kowtow to them and they want to be right on top of the food chain?
One is how China sees itself, and as you said, it looks at itself as the Middle Kingdom, because there is no doubt that through much of history, at least in Asia, there were only two really major powers. One was China, the other was India. You must have heard of the calculations which were done about the GDP of the two countries, and it was said that through at least up to maybe the 18th century, 50% of the world GDP was accounted for by India and China. So in a sense, what the Chinese are now saying is that with the kind of spectacular development that they have had over the last 3 decades, nothing more is happening than China going back to where it was as the dominant power in Asia. Secondly, the aspect of Middle Kingdom is because China, as the very large empire, was surrounded by, in fact, smaller kingdoms, smaller states. So there was this sense that, China is the center of civilization, and as you move away from that center, you have less and less civilized states. So, in a sense, the fact that countries like Japan or Korea or Vietnam, in one sense, adopted a lot of China's culture was also a demonstration that we are a superior culture. The kowtow that you're talking about is with reference to the tributary relationship, that many of the smaller states would send missions to China as supplicants, as tributaries. Much of this was not so much a political reality, but it was a kind of a ritual, relationship that China established. But history is a little more complicated than that. I mean, there were occasions where the Chinese were also supplicants and also tributaries to others. When they were defeated, for example, by the Tibetans. For quite some time, the Tang Empire was paying tribute to the Tibetan king. China was also occupied by other alien powers. For example, by the Mongols. So you had the Kublai Khan phase. Or later on, from the 17th century right up to 1911 by the Manchus. They were not a Han empire, that was an alien empire. So I think there is a certain kind of a, shall I say, I sometimes call it manufactured history, but maybe it is not so manufactured, but it's certainly very selective history. To try and put across a kind of a vision, historical vision of China, which is only partially true. And I think it is trying today, because of the economic and military capabilities it has, to somehow suggest that this was the natural order in the past. And we should be returning to that natural order, that there is a certain hierarchy in Asia, which is a natural hierarchy, and China should be at the top. But lastly, just to round off this argument, even if it was true that in the past China was surrounded by smaller and weaker states, that's no longer the case today. You can't by any stretch of imagination say that, for example, Japan, which is the third largest economy in the world and a very powerful country, that somehow it is a subordinate state, or should be a subordinate state. Or, for example, India itself, or Australia, or even, ROK, there are a cluster of major powers today in Asia, which will not accept any notion of a hierarchical system in the region.
And yet China is not only a big Asian power, but it is a rising world power. It is perhaps the largest economic, or at least the second largest economic power in the world, and is pretty much inching closer and closer to the US. So even if it wants to be on top of the hierarchy, would you say that countries like India, Japan, you talked about Australia, how should these countries deal with China?
Well, first of all, when we are looking at China as the emerging power, certainly there is no doubt, and we should, in fact, acknowledge the fact that there has been nothing short of a spectacular rise in China's economic and security capabilities. However, we should not make the mistake of just taking GDP as a metric of power. many things go into national power. The per capita income of China is still a fraction of what the United States has. So there is still some way to go.
But it is 5 times larger than the economy is large. 5 times
GDP
larger.
is 5 times that of India. I acknowledge that. But in terms of the metrics of power, as I said, even if you take, for example, defense, despite the growth that has taken place in China's security capabilities, there is no doubt that whether you are looking to the west of the Indian Ocean or you're looking to the east of the Indian Ocean, the most powerful country is still the United States in terms of the deployment of power. It still has a military budget which is several times more than the next few put together, including China. So in terms of sheer military power, still there is some way to go. And lastly, knowledge is a very important source of power. The United States of America, despite the fact that it may be in relative decline, continues to be the knowledge capital of the world. It's still the largest source of technological innovation. China is moving in that direction, but still has a long way to go. So I don't think we should exaggerate the scale of the power that China represents. And as I said, even if China desires to be the predominant power in Asia, there are other major powers which do not, I think, believe that they should accept a hierarchical system here which is dominated by China.
And yet, at the United Nations yesterday in New York, India's External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj met with foreign ministers from Japan and the US. So they had a trilateral meeting, and I'm imagining that on top of the agenda of that meeting was what to do with China.
Well, I think 2 things. One is that we should not sort of look at China only as a threat to be countered. China's growth is also an opportunity because of the fact that it represents a huge source of capital today. It represents an expanding market at a time when other traditional markets are in fact still flat. So we should have a more nuanced view of China, not merely look at it as a threat. So the emergence of China is a challenge, but it is a challenge which has certain positive attributes, it has certain negative attributes. As far as the trilateral that you spoke about, whenever you have a major power emerging and within such a short period of time, there is no doubt that there will be a countervailing kind of a coalition which will start crystallizing in order not to maybe contain it, because that's very difficult to do in the kind of interconnected, interdependent world we live in, but certainly to restrain the unilateral assertion of power, which may be a tendency which, an emerging power which has a certain arrogance about its ability to achieve what it wishes and they will brook no opposition. I think there has to be also a countervailing coalition in order to restrain.
So explain to us about the Doklam standoff, and in the wake of the Doklam standoff, when we saw India and Chinese troops disengage after 70 days or so, 70 or 72 days. How would you look at that?
Well, my view is that Doklam to begin with, or what happened in Doklam to begin with, was not really directed so much against India. Bhutan and China have been negotiating on their border, settlement of their border, for the last many years. They have had something like 24 rounds of talks. China has even made an offer which would involve, giving up some of the territory it claims in northern Bhutan for the Doklam plateau that we are talking about, which is also under dispute. More than just the territorial issue, China has been very keen that there should be exchange of diplomatic relations between the two countries, exchange of embassies, trade between the two countries. It considers it to be very abnormal that Bhutan is the only country in South Asia with which it does not have normal state-to-state.
They have a point, don't they?
Beg your pardon?
China has a point, isn't it? That Bhutan is the only country in South Asia that doesn't.
It may have. I'm not looking at whether it is justified or not. What I'm saying is that this is something which, from the Chinese perspective, is rather unusual and abnormal. I think this was to nudge Bhutan in the direction of coming to some conclusion with respect to, say, the border issue. That don't think that this offer is going to be lying on the shelf for you until you decide to do something about it. If you don't, there is the likelihood of our changing the status quo according to the claims that we have. So this was, to my mind, really a nudge to Bhutan. If, as a result, the Indians got a little more worried about the situation, so much the better. But that's a collateral benefit. I don't think that that was the real motive.
Do you think China succeeded in doing what it
No,
wanted?
I think the reason why many people ask me, why was there such a vitriolic reaction from China? As you mentioned, there was Depsang, there was Chumar. We have not seen that kind of a reaction from China as we saw this time. You know, even talking about, don't forget 1962. I mean, there was a People's Daily article which reproduced what they had said in an editorial in 1962. So this was unusual. Why did they react in this manner? They reacted in this manner precisely because they were caught by surprise. They had not expected that Indian forces will confront them, and that too in a third country. This was not part of the script. Now, when it doesn't go according to the script, then of course there is a anger about this, and you have to somehow, because it was presented maybe to the Chinese leadership as a very low risk, low cost kind of a move, suddenly it became a high risk kind of a move. So much of the vitriol, much of the sort of day in and day out making threatening noises was partly to see whether that would succeed in getting the Indians to stand back. That did not happen. Now, I think number one, the Indian side was, I think, very, very mature in its reaction. Did not rise to the bait with the kind of aggressive, reaction from China, and the objective from the Indian side, and I would say from the Bhutanese side, was a very limited one, which is to see how the status quo could be restored. Whatever may be the fluff around this, the fact is that that limited objective was achieved. And in some sense, relations are somewhat back on track. Will this happen in the future again?
Yeah.
Difficult to say. But I would say that at least having this diffused in the manner that was achieved, I think was a good result.
So to ask the question, will it ever happen again? Because as we saw on the map, you have the western sector which is contested, the Aksai Chin area, which is one of the ears of India when you see the map. Then again in the eastern sector, Arunachal Pradesh is almost in its entirety claimed by China, 90,000 square kilometers. You have the line of actual control, you have the border. This whole 3,500 kilometer border between India and China is disputed, or most of it is disputed. So do you think it could happen again?
Well, the good news is that for the last several years, and you mentioned the Peace and Tranquility Agreement which was concluded in 1993, despite the fact that we have had incidents like Chumar or Depsang, by and large, given the extent of dispute that exists between India and China, actually this has been one of the more peaceful borders in the recent past. So that's the good news, that the confidence building measures that have been negotiated between the two sides by and large have worked. A certain status quo has been in place for quite some time, and the longer the status quo continues, the less the likelihood of either side wanting to make a radical change in that. So there is a certain stability with respect to the border, and I think even though we have not been able to resolve the border dispute, And currently, it would seem unlikely that we would resolve it in the near future. The fact is that both sides are reasonably confident that peace can be maintained. The difference today is that on the Chinese side, as you know, a tremendous development of border infrastructure has been taking place. So a lot of highways are being built on the Chinese side. The kind of installations that you have along the border, certainly much better than in the past, and certainly better than what the Indian side has.
So why hasn't India been able to?
So India too is doing that. It is not to say that the Indian side is not building up its infrastructure, but the asymmetry between the two sides is still pretty large. However, what I would like to point out is that the reason why I say that there could be more incidents in the future is that the improvement of infrastructure has led to more frequent patrols in more remote areas than was the case before, both on the Indian side as well as on the Chinese side. So if your patrols were visiting a remote area, say once in 1 month, today, because the roads have improved, because the communications are much better, you are perhaps going to that remote place maybe 4 times a month or 5 times a month. So the chances of encounters between Indian patrols and the Chinese patrols, that has suddenly expanded in a sense. So there are more incidents taking place, and perhaps both sides need to acknowledge that the situation has changed and need to perhaps upgrade the kind of confidence building measures we need to deal with this.
Sir, talk to us about the relationship between China and Pakistan. It's a very close relationship. They describe it as being higher than the mountains and deeper than the seas. What do you think?
Well, probably it is. Pakistan's role for most of the time has been that of a very, again, I would say, low-cost proxy against India. You know, things that you would not want to do in direct confrontation with India, this is a cheaper way of doing it through Pakistan. So I'm not surprised that Pakistan is a very useful ally for China. But I think what we need to today understand is that what was perhaps that major objective of China developing close relations with Pakistan has now undergone some change. And the change is because China in becoming a major power is now looking at a global role for itself, a larger regional role for itself. You know, you have the One Belt, One Road, where you have maritime routes, you have, routes through Central Asia. In that scheme, Pakistan has become a very important component. So it is not only the terminus of the land routes from Central Asia, from Chinese Central Asia, but the Ghadar port is also a very important link in terms of the maritime routes that China is developing as part of One Belt, One Road. So there is now a certain new strategic dimension, a longer term, value of Pakistan to China. So there is a certain change which is taking place where China is perhaps more committed to Pakistan and to the security of Pakistan than perhaps would have been the case. So there was, over a period of time, as you would have noticed, a certain attempt to be even-handed between India and Pakistan. Don't talk so much about Kashmir. Say we would like the two countries to resolve these outstanding problems in a friendly way. China not taking sides. Today, if you look at what China has been doing, for example, with the listing of some of the Pakistan-based terrorist groups in the United Nations, they are willing, despite the fact that this is gaining some opprobrium for them internationally, they don't mind. Or standing purely as the one country preventing India's entry into the NSG. Something that 10 years ago they were not prepared to do. They were not prepared to stand up as the one country saying no to India getting the waiver from the nuclear suppliers group. Today, they don't mind because the value of Pakistan for them has grown over the last few years.
But if you look at South Asia, China has very good relations with all of India's neighbors, with Nepal, for example. Nepal is part of the One Belt, One Road. With Sri Lanka, where China is building the port in Hambantota. Bangladesh, where it's cut a check of $29 billion for Sheikh Hasina.
Not yet.
Well, it's promised that it will cut a check of $29 billion for Bangladesh, for Sheikh Hasina. And India and Bangladesh have very good relations. We have Pakistan on India's western border. What do you make of this? Some people call it an encirclement of India.
Well, number one, you must understand that when you are a very large country, surrounded by relatively smaller neighbors, it should come as no surprise to you that sitting in those capitals, there is an apprehension of Indian domination by these countries. So we should not get too prickly about it, because that is inherent in the asymmetry that exists between India and the neighbors. We have great assets in terms of strengthening our relationship with these countries. It's not a matter of, are we loved or are we not loved by these? I mean, this frequently comes up, none of our neighbors love us. This is not a matter of love affair. I think it's a question of, are you able to put in place strong interdependency, strong leverage that in fact enables you to be, to safeguard your interests in relations with that country. You take Bhutan, for example. We have developed very strong interdependency with the growth of, with Indian assistance, of hydropower in that country. We are a very big purchaser of electricity from Bhutan. Bhutan, thanks to that, is today perhaps the richest country in South Asia in per capita terms. Now, that is the kind of interdependency that you need to build with your neighbors. So that with that interdependency, they have a stake in your prosperity. You become the engine of growth for your neighbors. The very asymmetry which seems to be a disadvantage actually becomes a huge advantage if you are the fastest growing, emerging economy in the world. You have such a huge market. If you just opened up your market to everything that each of your neighbors is able to sell, even then it will be a small fraction of your market.
But you haven't been able to do this with Bangladesh, with Nepal.
Well, it's not that we have not been able to do anything. But the fact is that the speed with which we need to move and the delivery capability that we should have, if we promise a project, we should be able to implement it in time. Now, the problem is a governance issue. It is not only that you have delays in implementing what you promised in Nepal or in Bhutan, but you also have a problem doing it in India itself. So I think you need to be able to address that. The great credibility that China has is precisely that it is able to move very fast in terms of implementing projects, and we suffer by comparison. So the important thing is to understand. I mean, from a foreign policy professional point of view, I would say if you leave spaces open, somebody is going to walk in. So it is up to you to make certain that you don't leave those vacant spaces. You should utilize the great assets that you have, whether it is in terms of cultural affinity, whether it is in terms of proximity, whether, as I said, in terms of what we can do to really contribute to the economic development of our neighbors. So they begin to see you as an opportunity, not as a threat. That is the mind change that you have to bring about.
But you left the space open in Pakistan. You had huge cultural affinities with Pakistan. You have language, you have music, you have Hindi films, Bollywood. We are sitting in Mumbai.
Well,
what happened?
I'm glad that you brought that up. My view has been that whatever you need to do to confront Pakistan in terms of its hostile behavior, and there are, in the book itself, I have mentioned what are the ways in which you can use pressure points against Pakistan. But I would also say that the very things that, in fact, attract Pakistani citizens to India. You mentioned Bollywood. If there are Pakistani actors who want to come and work in Bollywood, I would say, let more come. If there are Pakistani authors who want to come and launch their books in India, because this is a bigger market, let more of them come. Because the more exposure that the Pakistanis have, ordinary Pakistanis have to the reality of India, the kind of, edge of hostility that you have, not immediately, not overnight, but over a period of time, it will start blunting that. Because, when you are exposed to reality, it is very difficult to maintain the kind of, contrived hostility that has been, the hallmark of Pakistani behavior towards India.
So my last question before we open this to the House is about Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping, both very powerful leaders in each of their respective countries. Xi Jinping is the party congress is going to be held next month in October, and he will likely be re-elected president. But what do you make of this? There was this very powerful photograph in 2014 when the Chinese president came to Ahmedabad and Prime Minister Modi welcomed him, and they're sitting on that jhula, swinging on that, on the banks of the Sabarmati
That's why
River.
they say India is a swing state.
Right. But this relationship between these two powerful leaders, what do you make of it?
Well, the interesting thing is that when Prime Minister Narendra Modi, came into office, and you had Xi Jinping, both were regarded as you said, very, very strong leaders, tremendous political capital. Both Chinese as well as Indians were saying, now we have an opportunity that we have two very strong leaders that they will sit down together and resolve all the outstanding problems that we have. Now, 2 or 3 years later, the same figure is being used that here are two very strong leaders. That is why they can't get along together. And that is why it is so difficult to solve problems between the two countries. But I would like to point out something which is very important and which was demonstrated again in Xiamen in the last summit that they had. Yeah. My own experience over the last 15 years or so has been that there have been always difficult problems between the two countries. Not only the border issue, but several other issues. But what has been a remarkable feature is that from the time that leaders of the two countries started having very regular summit meetings, not only bilateral summit, but summits on the sidelines of BRICS meetings or trilateral meeting or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, several occasions for the leaders to actually engage with one another. And there has been a willingness on the part of both sides to have those kind of summit meetings. And those summit meetings have played actually a very stabilizing role in India-China relations. So that, to my mind, was also demonstrated by the results of the Xiamen meeting. That the message which went to both systems, in a sense, was that the leaders are interested in keeping the relations on an even keel. And that becomes very important. So I would hope that going forward, this tradition of having regular kind of summit meetings is something that we can maintain.
Right, we'll open this up to the House. So if anybody has a question, please do identify yourself. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, sir. First of all,
do you want to tell us your name and what you do?
I'm Apramaya Rao, and I'm a recent graduate of economics. First of all, I read your book. It's a great book, and especially the part where you talk.
Everybody buy it.
Yeah, and especially the part where you describe China and history behind why China is, why it is this way. My question is, you have been an ambassador to Myanmar, and the McMahon line, which is the border between India and China, is also the same line which demarcates Myanmar and China. While in 1960, Myanmar and Burma and China came to a conclusion on this issue on McMahon line. The same but the problem still persists in India. Why do you think is this problem still persisting with India? Is it because China wants to keep India in check? Because India is a potential rival of China? Is that the reason why this border issue is still kept hot and burning?
So if you have read the book, you will find the answer there, that at least until 1958, just as China was willing to accept the McMahon Line as the boundary between Burma and China, although it said it is imperialist past, but for friendly relations, we are willing to accept this alignment. The same was true with India. That is the same thing which was conveyed to India as well, that we don't like the McMahon Line, but we are willing to live with it. As I have described in the book, the change that came about was in 1958 when we discovered the Aksai Chin Road, and we said Aksai Chin is part and parcel of inalienable Indian territory. So the Chinese, because at that particular point of time, Aksai Chin was strategically very, very important to them, because that was the main route from mainland China into Tibet. And Tibet was still not fully under their control. As we saw in 1959, the revolt broke out. So for them, this road was very important and this region was very important. So if you look in the book, then the Chinese decided that if we give up our claim in the east, then we do not have a bargaining counter for the territory in the west, which is so important for us. So they actually then, after 1958, they linked the two things together. So after that, till at least 1985, the Chinese offer was a package proposal, which was you keep what you have in the east and we will keep what we have in the west. That would be a fair exchange, which we, of course, rejected. Now, if you say, why are they now insisting that there should be concessions from India even in the eastern sector? It is precisely because, as far as the west part is concerned, the strategic importance of that is no longer there. So much of infrastructure development has taken place throughout Tibet. They don't need that road in order to consolidate their position in Tibet. So the bargaining chip argument is no longer so important. So it is in 1985 that they actually changed their interpretation of what the package proposal was. Until then, as I said, it was you keep what you have in the east and we will keep what we have in the west. In 1985, they changed it to say, no, because the area of largest dispute is in the eastern sector, you have to make meaningful concessions in the eastern sector and we will give you some unspecified, some concession in the western sector. So the goalposts, in fact, move further against us. So right now, formally, that is the position that we have. That is what changed in the 1985 position. Naturally, if you look at it from the Indian point of view, it is very difficult to accept that we would have to give up substantial territory in the east in order to settle the border question, including Tawang, which is in 1985 was the first time that China said you have to return Tawang as well. So it's not a matter of is this being kept alive by China to put pressure on us. The more important question is on what basis are you going to settle the boundary issue? And what will be acceptable to the Indian side? And is there likelihood of what would be politically acceptable here, whether that would be politically also saleable in China? That's really the problem. At the moment, we don't have that kind of at least I do not see that in the near future we would have some close alignment in the perceptions of the two sides.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah. No, okay, and after him, then you can ask your question. Yeah. Okay,
Good evening, sir. I'm Karan Shivali. I'm a student of law from Government Law College. My question is, after the Doklam issue, the Nepalis got the chills because even there are two tri-junctions in Nepal, and one of them is snow-clad most of the year, but other is Lipu Lake. And there was a common sentiment in the Nepali Democrats and thinkers that this tri-junction could be the next scare for Nepalis too. And the next question is, what do the China-Pakistan economic corridor has effects on the relations of India and China in future?
I'm sorry, I didn't get what you mentioned about Nepal.
Yeah, after the Bhutan standoff,
yes.
Nepalis and Bhutanese people, I read in some articles, they feel sandwiched between India and China due to those two powers. So they have a feeling of, they're afraid that the tri-junctions in Nepal could be the next Doklam due to Chinese interference. And they think that India is trying to keep Bhutan under its thumb, and Nepal could be the next in line due to those great powers.
Well, the choices which Bhutan and Nepal make will be choices in relation to how they see their own interests. As you saw with respect to Doklam, this is something which Bhutan considered to be a threat to its security. And what we were able to achieve, don't forget, is very importantly because India and Bhutan stood together. That is a very important aspect, and we should not minimize the importance of Bhutan's attitude in this respect. Now, what happens with Nepal remains to be seen, because in Nepal, unlike Bhutan, there is a strong body of opinion which believes that having much stronger relations with China is one way of, meeting the danger of possible domination by India. As long as that psychology is there, that we must maintain a balance between India and China, this will keep cropping up. How do we deal with that? By the way, what may be true with respect to Nepal is also true, as Jyoti mentioned, with respect to many of our other neighbors. So that is something that in any case, we have to try and deal with. As I said, your response should be not, this is my backyard, everybody keep out, but more, what is it that we can do to make the relationship with India the preferred relationship, whether it is in terms of economic interest, whether it is in terms of cultural affinity. I should be the preferred choice in terms of the interest that Nepal has or Bangladesh has or any other neighbor has. That has to be the way in which you should think about your neighborhood policy. And as far as the CPEC is concerned, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, obviously India was right in expressing its objection, because it is coming through territory which we say is an integral part of India. So there is every justification for us to object to this infrastructure development taking place through what is our territory. Now, the argument may be used by China that why are you raising territorial issues, because this connectivity that is being established with this corridor is for regional benefit. So you should not raise this. But you may have seen just a few days ago that when Japan announced that it is going to do some projects for India in Arunachal, how strongly the Chinese objected, saying this is territory which belongs to China. How dare you do projects here? So why did this double standard? So we should not accept this kind of double standard. And even if you use the connectivity argument, I have asked my Chinese friends, okay, if you make this corridor through Pakistan, will Pakistan give us transit through Pakistan? Because otherwise, of what use is it? That they say, no, that is for Pakistan to decide. So what's there in it for us?
Okay, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. My name is Sumit Walunj. I'm a mechanical engineer by profession and a civil service aspirant. Sir,
I can't see you.
You want to stand up?
Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sir. My name is Sumit Walunj. I'm a mechanical engineer by profession and civil service aspirant. Sir, my question to you is that India has not signed the agreement to join OBOR. Okay. But the major sponsor for OBOR is ADB and AIIB, for which India is a participatory member. So, can we say that if India is not going with OBOR, India should also voluntarily get out of AIIB and ADB, because directly or indirectly they are supporting all the projects which is being run by OBOR or by CPEC, which so-called affects the sovereignty of India.
Excellent question.
Yeah. So, we number one, there is no signing on to OBOR. It's not as if there is a document saying this is OBOR and you sign on to it. No such thing. So if countries are invited to join the OBOR, that is as projects which Chinese money capital will be able to do in those partner countries. So unlike the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank or the BRICS Development Bank, or even I would say something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, what is the difference from OBOR? The difference is that OBOR is not a multilateral project. It is a string of bilateral deals between China and a partner country. Okay, so there is nothing multilateral about it. In the case of AIIB, we were very active in shaping that institution. The whole architecture of this institution, a very important role was played by India. AIIB, the second largest shareholder is India, right? Its lending policies with regard to specific projects, we have a voice in what can be financed and what cannot be financed. So these are two, don't make any confusion between these two things. These are two completely different things. And there is no such thing as AIIB financing OBOR, because there is no such thing as OBOR. There is no multilateral sort of project which is posed to, say, the ADB or to the AIIB. What is posed to the AIIB or to the ADB are specific projects. There is an irrigation project which has to be financed, or there is a port project to be financed. Whether it is part of OBOR or not part of OBOR is immaterial. So there is no contradiction between our being a shareholder of AIIB or of the ADB and these financing some projects which may be posed to the AIIB, which the Chinese may say, yes, it is part of OBOR, that's fine, that's up to you. If tomorrow, you see, we have even told the Chinese, with respect to OBOR, if you tell us that there is, say, a project in Indonesia, a port project in Indonesia, let India and China work together in that project. How do we finance it together? What kind of technology we can bring? What kind of capacity building which we can do? Then we have no problem. But if you say, this is our design of what project should be, and you sign on to it, as you said, which is also not, there is no signing on, as I said, it's basically a declaration that, you accept the OBOR. Then it would be different. But that is not what is on offer. So if there has been some sense of caution on the part of India with respect to OBOR, I think that is well-founded. And we should not worry about, because we have not declared ourselves to OBOR, we will miss out on something. There is nothing to miss out. See, if there is a Chinese firm which is getting a lot of profit in India, because this is such a huge market, will the fact that I have joined the OBOR or not joined the OBOR keep them away? After all, you have Alibaba, which is doing huge business through Paytm. You have Xiaomi, the mobile telephone. This is their biggest market, and it's an expanding market. You have Huawei, which has such huge stakes here. Are they going to say, because India has not signed the OBOR, so we are going away from India? That's their loss, not mine.
So should you welcome Chinese investment in India, knowing that you could have standoffs like Doklam or elsewhere on the border?
Well, as I mentioned to you, that the record over the last several years, at least for the last 15, 20 years, has been a remarkable ability on the part of the Indians and the Chinese to be able to manage these thorny issues between them, and at the same time, take advantage of economic opportunities that China offers to India and also India offers to China. If we are able to expand that economic and commercial relationship, over a period of time, it may even have a positive impact on the political relationship. I'm not saying that it will enable us to solve problems, but in managing those problems, perhaps, an expanded economic relationship may not be such a bad idea.
Okay. Where are the girls? I can't see any hand up.
Hello, my name is Soham Joshi, and I'm a student of political science. I basically have two questions. Why is the way China is acting, we can say it's very natural. It's basically trying to define global agenda by the way it's acting in Doklam, the way it has built its first international base in Djibouti, and also this assertion in South China Sea. So that's what the US also did in the 1950s. And I want to know, is it the natural way to do things? And my second question is, basically, when they came to Doklam, why did Indian troops have to interfere? Is it just because uh, we are related with the Bhutan army, or is it because it's really close to the chicken's neck? That's all.
Uh, as I mentioned to you, that the fact that this was happening, this road was being built, was brought to our attention by the Bhutanese. And my sense is, even I'm not in government, so I can't really, say this with any degree of confidence, but I imagine that whatever action was taken by India, and even the fact that it was diffused over a period of time, the Bhutan and India worked in very close consultation with one another, very closely together with one another. And that was a very important factor, as I mentioned to you, in the successful management of this. If India and Bhutan had not been on the same page, it would have been very difficult to manage this. So, why did India do this? It is, if we are talking about chicken's neck, the security of that corridor is important not only for India. It is also important for Bhutan, because all the communication lines of Bhutan also go through the same chicken's neck. So it is not as if, oh, this was only important for India, but we somehow dragged Bhutan into this. That is not the case. If you look at the map, it is as important to Bhutan. So we should perhaps look at all aspects of this particular incident before we come to any kind of conclusion. I think the relationship between India and Bhutan is a very privileged one. It is a very special kind of a relationship, which is why, as we started talking about how China considers it very unnatural, isn't it? That, they still don't have, the only one South Asian country with which they don't have diplomatic relations or exchange of embassies is only Bhutan. So it is because there is a good understanding between India and Bhutan that we have been able to manage these kind of issues.
So on the other question about, I think you're, the South China Sea.
Any country, and I include India in that, any country which is an emerging country, whose economic capabilities, security capabilities are expanding, will naturally want to play a bigger role in international affairs, in regional affairs as well as international affairs. And in a sense, over a period of time, there was even a certain convergence between India and China, because as two largest emerging economies, there was also a sense that if we work together, we can perhaps achieve more in terms of adjusting some of the international regimes and shaping some of the new regimes, like, for example, climate change. If India and China work together, they would be able to get a better climate change regime than if they worked separately. So it is not at all unnatural and not even unjustified for a country which is expanding its capabilities to want to play a bigger role. The question is, what is the manner in which you play that role? So if you take, say, Southeast Asia, or you take South China Sea, China will use the argument that, it's all its lifeline, the sea lines of communication for its trade, for its energy supplies, go through this maritime route. Therefore, it is quite natural that China should be interested in safeguarding those routes. My answer to that would be, so is the case with us. Our lifelines are also through the same maritime routes. Or for many of the Southeast Asian countries is also the same. Now, if every country, every power tries to unilaterally defend its interests, then you end up with what actually is happening today in Southeast Asia, where the most rapid expansion of military expenditures and military capabilities is taking place there. And not just China. Every country in the region is actually increasing its defense expenditure and expanding its military capabilities, particularly naval capabilities. Now, our view has been that since all of us have similar concerns, instead of each country trying to unilaterally assert its power and trying to defend its interests, is it not better to have some kind of a multilateral understanding or mutual reassurance? Because if all of us keep increasing our military expenditures and capabilities, we keep cancelling each other out. So this is a question of, what is the kind of approach you want to adopt? If the perception in China is that its interests are better served through the unilateral assertion of power, not through multilateral understanding, then of course you will see the kind of behavior which we have witnessed. And that kind of behavior should be constrained. As I said, there has to be some countervailing action in order to prevent that unilateral assertion of power. Not that it is illegitimate on the part of China to seek a bigger role, but it should seek that bigger role not at the expense of other countries.
Hello, sir. Good evening. Myself, Mayur Rasa. I am a final year engineering student. Sir, my question is to you is, sir, it is told that the failure of diplomatic channel leads to war. Or that in that case, looking forward, if that situation occurs, how do you see it will affect the two emerging countries, India and China? And my second question is, sir, China's role, China's stand in the issue of Rohingyas going forward, and North Korea. How do you see a situation ahead? Thanks.
Well, I think we should be very happy that diplomacy did succeed in preventing what could have been an escalation, for example, on Doklam. We did manage through diplomacy, very quiet diplomacy, to diffuse the situation so that, Prime Minister was able to go to Xiamen, attend the BRICS summit. There was a good result of that summit. So diplomacy, of course, has a very important role to play. But diplomacy can only work if you don't project your interests in absolute terms. If you pose issues in black and white terms, then the space for diplomacy gets shrunk. So you must always leave room for diplomacy to work, because diplomacy is what? Seeking compromise, seeking some kind of a mutual understanding. How will you have mutual understanding if you pose your interests in very absolute terms? So this is a lesson that we have to constantly keep in mind, that we need to not shrink that space for diplomacy. With regard to what China may be doing with North Korea. Now, one is, you should understand that North Korea is a neighbor. If North Korea and South Korea become united, and a much more powerful Korea emerges, and if that powerful Korea is also allied to the United States of America, then China, looking from the perspective of China, this would be not a very happy development. So I can see why China would like not to push the situation in a direction that, say, there is a regime collapse in North Korea, and by default, as it happened in Germany, East and West Germany, supposing you have this happening here, this would not be a very positive from the Chinese perspective. At the same time, I think China is also very worried that this nuclear development which is taking place in North Korea, if it goes beyond a certain threshold and invites, in fact, a counter-attack, say, from the United States of America, then it would face China with very difficult choices. How do you respond to that? If say, tomorrow an American preemptive attack takes place on nuclear facilities in North Korea, how will you react? So, it is in China's interest to try and keep the situation under some control. not necessarily to encourage North Korea, but at the same time, not allow the situation to get to a point where, its own interests are very, very much threatened. So it is really walking a tightrope. It is warning the United States, don't use any kind of, preemptive attack or military threats against North Korea. At the same time, it is going along, say, with UN sanctions against North Korea. It's a very, the choices are very difficult for China. We should recognize that. The other problem is that if, as a result of the development of nuclear weapons by North Korea, if there is in Japan, for example, or in South Korea, there is a sense that the only way that you can deal with this by becoming nuclear yourself, become a nuclear weapon state yourself, then that will hugely complicate the regional security situation, even the global security situation. That China would not like to see. I doubt whether any other country, including India, would like to see such a situation develop. So we are at a very difficult juncture at the moment, and we hope that this does not become something much more difficult to resolve than is already the case. And as far as Myanmar is concerned, of course, China has very close relations with Myanmar. It is a good example of how China is able to use what may be a short-term opportunity, which was offered by the isolation of the old, military regime in Myanmar, to put in place long-term assets. The linkages, for example, economic linkages across the border have become very dense. The military relationship is very strong, despite the fact that after the changeover that has taken place, the political changes that have taken place in Myanmar, there have been doubts expressed about the close relationship with China. In fact, Myanmar has developed very close relations with the US, with other countries. Despite that, Myanmar has not been able to really move away so much from China because of the fact that those very strong interdependencies have been built up. Now, on the Rohingya issue, see how they have, tried to take advantage of what is Myanmar government is in trouble, is getting isolated. They are presenting themselves as a country which supports. So that, again, expands their influence. Maybe short-term calculation, but it gives them some, limited gains.
But so on the Rohingya issue, what do you make of India's statement on Myanmar? First, it was critical of the Rohingya. Then it changed its own statement when the Bangladeshis came in.
Well, it's also a difficult issue for us. I would say that, given what India stands for, I would say that any position that we must get rid of these migrants, try and send them back, knowing full well that much more difficulty will await them if they go back to Myanmar. I don't find that to be in keeping with India's traditions, in keeping with Indian values. If they have come seeking shelter in India, I think we should give them shelter. Yes, there may be issues of security relating to, say, the Rohingya Liberation Organization. I think some doubts have been expressed about, how there may be some jihadist elements in that. Yes, that has to be certainly something that we must be mindful of and try and deal with that. But it cannot be a blanket kind of a, that we should send them all back. I don't think that is in keeping with our values, as I said. So it is a difficult issue, for us, because there is a genuine, fear of the security threat which may come. But I think in dealing with this, are there ways in which we can help Myanmar to deal with this situation? So it is a good thing that some assistance has been offered in terms of humanitarian assistance to the camps which have come up, and to see how we can persuade the Myanmar government to take perhaps a more reasonable stand. But it is a very difficult issue because it is a very emotive issue in Myanmar itself.
Okay, so we'll take the last 2 or 3 questions. Yes.
Sir, my name is Riddhish and I'm a lawyer I'm studying law from KC College, so pardon my nitpicking, but in your book you've said the neglect of these places, this is with respect to Northeast India, it says the neglect of these places has resulted from the notion that our defense is best served by keeping them underdeveloped and remote, encouraging only defense-related infrastructure to be built in those parts. So, pardon my ignorance, but does this mean that we are treating Northeast India as an anticipatory scorched earth policy? And also, are we really letting letting foreign policy dwarf domestic policy? Because I don't see any metropolitan city in Northeast India. China has built trains, airports, highways in their part of Tibet, and here we are still selling Northeast India as a tourist destination. This is question number 1. And the second question is that, is NSG just a way for the Prime Minister to score brownie points, or is it really a political necessity for India?
Well, as far as the Northeast is concerned, there is no doubt that this has been an area which has been in relative neglect. We need to not only improve connectivity with the Northeast, but within the Northeast. That is, if you have to travel, for example, within the Northeast from one state capital to another, most of the time you have either to come down to Guwahati or to Calcutta before you can go to the next capital. So the infrastructure development in these areas has been very, very sparse. And we need to address that. So the good news is that it is being addressed. After several years of neglect, it is being addressed. New highways are being built. As you know, several of the state capitals will now have airports, which they did not have before. The government has introduced a scheme for subsidizing, regional airlines to serve some of these state capitals. I mentioned the fact that Japan, for example, is helping with several projects for developing the infrastructure there. So the good news is that much of that neglect is slowly being addressed. Maybe not fast enough, but it has to be addressed. What I was referring to was the fact that over a period of time, some of the infrastructure development was not pursued because of the sense that if we have too many, north-south, for example, alignments, it will be easier for an invading army to come in, if using those infrastructure developments. That is exactly. So it has taken us some time to overcome that kind of a psychology. Your best defense is actually a well-developed Northeast with people who do not feel alienated from the rest of the country, who feel that they are well integrated with the rest of the country. That is the way in which you should deal with this. So these are attitudes which may have been inherited from the past. This inner line permit I have referred to. Why do you need an inner line permit in your own country? Why should any part of your country be closed off to or restricted to other citizens of India? Why? Doesn't make any sense. You don't have an inner line permit, for example, with an even more difficult border with Pakistan. Why do you have an inner line permit in the Northeast? It doesn't make sense to me. So you need to develop the Northeast. You need to develop connectivity in this region. That is the best bet in terms of securing India's interest. And you mentioned tourism. Of course you should develop tourism. Why not? If tourism can be a source of revenue, can be a source of employment in the Northeast, it is something that I would very happily agree that we should develop.
Okay, I'm not going to allow this evening to end if a woman doesn't ask a question. Yes, go ahead. Oh, you do? Okay, then it's your turn.
Good evening. I'm Suhasini. I'm a student of political science. My question is, which is the bigger reason for withdrawal of confrontation in Doklam? The upcoming elections where Xi Jinping is hopeful of getting re-elected, or our successful negotiation and our unyielding stand at Doklam? Which is the bigger reason?
Well, I would say not just one reason. I would not underestimate the value of diplomacy in this respect, and the fact that we kept the channels of communication open with the Chinese side. That the Chinese would have wanted not to negatively impact the forthcoming, BRICS summit. After all, they were the hosts. That was perhaps an important consideration. The fact that there is going to be, as you mentioned, in October, there is going to be a major party congress, which in terms of Xi Jinping's leadership, a consolidation of his leadership would be very important. Obviously, they would have played a role in promoting, diffusing the situation. So it is not that it was only one factor. That the Indian diplomacy was able to take that into account, that because of these factors, perhaps we have a greater chance of being able to persuade China to diffuse the situation. And I think it was a very good outcome. Did that play the more important role? I don't know, but I think all of them played it. Even if those were there, but you did not have this diplomacy, then nothing may have happened. So I think all these factors played a role in allowing a successful outcome to be achieved.
Okay, absolutely the last question. The young man at the back, yes.
I thought you were going to the young lady.
She's asked her.
My name is Shubham and preparing for civil services. So we have seen that there is already a deficit of Indian trade with China during the past years. So how do you think the trade will affect our Indian trade will affect after the Doklam issue?
So far, we have not seen any adverse impact.
Do you think that it will affect after
trade relations, and as I said, in terms of the sort of long-term plans of some of the major Chinese companies in India, and also I would say Indian companies operating in China, we have not so far seen any kind of a negative impact.
Sir, can I ask you about the Dalai Lama? He escaped from Tibet in 1959 and is an 82-year-old man, lives in India today. Do you think that's a factor in the India-China relationship?
Tibet is obviously a factor, because don't forget that 1962 happened in a sense because of the revolt in Tibet, and His Holiness coming to India, large number of Tibetans coming to India. From the Chinese perspective, at a time when their control and consolidation of Tibet was very weak, it is not surprising to me that they saw what were perhaps not Indian actions to threaten China, but they were looked upon by China as very threatening. And even today, Tibet continues to be a factor in their calculations. The fact that His Holiness is in India, the fact that there is a large Tibetan community in India, this does, of course, influence their perceptions of India. And which is why I think an Indian effort to try and promote some kind of a reconciliation between His Holiness and the Chinese is something which is perhaps worth looking at.
Thank you so much. I know I speak on behalf of every Indian Express reader in this room, and thank you so much, sir, for giving us this lesson in India-China relations. Thank you. I really, really appreciate it. A big hand, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much.